The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings for the Housing Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 45A, the second marshalled list and the second grouping of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds thereafter and will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat function as soon as possible after I call the group. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. We have reached Group 19, Housing and Homelessness, Supporting Persons Experiencing etc. abuse. And I call Amendment 309 in the name of Katie Clark, group with amendments as shown in the grouping. Katie Clark to move Amendment 309 and speak to the other amendments in the group. Ms Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I speak to Amendment 309 and my other amendments in this group. Amendment 309 requires relevant bodies to ask individuals whom they have reason to believe might be homeless or threatened with homelessness whether their situation arose as a result of either past or ongoing experience of abuse. Amendment 310 defines abuse under the definition outlined in section 43 of the bill, or as conduct which gives rise or is likely to give rise to physical or mental injury, fear, alarm or distress. Amendments 311 and 312 require the relevant body, where it is informed that a person is either homeless or threatened with homelessness as a consequence of having experienced or experiencing abuse, to provide details of support to that person. Amendments 328 and 329 were lodged after discussions with the Children and Young Persons Commissioner Scotland, highlighting the need for greater security for victims of domestic abuse who may be left vulnerable to homelessness after ending a joint tenancy with their abusers. Amendment 328 would allow a joint tenant to end their interest in the tenancy if they have experienced, are experiencing or are at risk of experiencing domestic abuse without giving notice to the other joint tenant. This amendment requires that where a landlord, and it is a social landlord that this amendment applies to, receives notice under this provision, they must provide the tenant with details of such support which may be available to them in relation to domestic abuse. The amendment addresses a gap in the law and similar issues which I spoke to in my Amendment 393 last week. Social landlords are clear that they need this statutory footing to be able to implement their domestic abuse policies, and this amendment relates to social landlords, not the private sector. I raised this issue at Stage 3 and had discussions both with the Cabinet Secretary and her predecessor. Given this amendment relates to domestic abuse in circumstances where the landlord accepts there is domestic abuse or has been domestic abuse, a longer period than 1 week's notice should not be required, and 1 week's notice is sufficient. As I said, this amendment is being requested by social landlords. The Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, for example, said in their briefing for this debate that they strongly support this amendment. It is needed for them to implement domestic abuse policies, and indeed is being asked for by various campaigns. Amendment 329 again relates to social landlords and requires a domestic abuse policy to include steps which can be taken to write off rent arrears where there has been a domestic abuse. I move the amendments in my name.
Thank you, Ms Clark. I now call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 240 and the other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll begin by addressing some of Katie Clark's amendments 309, 310. These would oblige the relevant body to ask whether a person is homelessness or threatened with homelessness as a result of abuse. And Amendments 311 and 312 refer to providing details of support services, as Ms Clark has set out. Now, I'm pleased to confirm that all four of these amendments are already catered for in the bill. The bill contains provisions on addressing homelessness arising from abuse, including duties on relevant bodies to provide appropriate support. Indeed, Section 45 of the bill will require all local authorities and registered social landlords to publish a policy setting out how they support tenants who have experienced, are experiencing or are at risk of domestic abuse. Landlords will have to take into account the guidance from the Scottish Ministers on how these policies should be developed and how they should be used. The guidance could require information on support services to form part of the support offered, and I would intend to work with Katie Clark and with others for whom I know this is a priority on the development of that guidance. Amendments 240 and 241 in my name ensure that the term abuse is used consistently in the Housing Act of 1987. One part of the Act currently refers to, quote, domestic abuse, but the bill includes a broader definition of abuse to cover a wider range of harmful behaviours. So my amendment updates the wording so that the broader definition is used and that this is in line with the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 21. Maggie Chapman's Amendment 327 is not required, as mine that I've just elaborated on ensures that the broader definition is used throughout. Now, moving to Amendment 328, the first part of this, and this is one of Katie Clark's amendments, the first part would require ministers to lay regulations to commence Part 2 of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 21. I've discussed with Katie Clark that I am entirely committed to doing this, and I confirmed to Ruth Maguire during part of last week's Stage 3 consideration that it's my intention to lay regulations to ensure that Part 2 of the 21 Act comes into force, and my aim is to do this by Christmas. I want these powers in force. Now, had this been an amendment on its own, I would have accepted it, but I'm afraid there's a fundamental problem with the second part of the amendment, which means that I can't, because the amendment goes on, as has been set out, to seek to reduce the statutory notice period for a victim or survivor of domestic abuse to end their interest in a joint tenancy from 4 weeks to 1 week, and crucially, to remove the requirement to notify a joint tenant and to do so without landlord's consent. Now, creating a circumstance where a joint tenant could unilaterally end a joint tenancy at short notice would be extremely challenging. It could be open to misinterpretation. It could be open even to misuse. The amendment would represent a significant change to the property rights of social landlords and therefore to the operation of social housing. It could unintentionally provide a route for any tenant to leave their tenancy on 1 week's notice, and we can imagine the impact that would have on social housing. Just to expand this bit a little bit more, because I know that there are interest in this. Speaking of interest, I'll absolutely take Mr Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary say that the Domestic Abuse Protection Act would be implemented in full, and I welcome the swiftness that is going to be brought to that. I recognise that the second part of this amendment is very complex indeed and involves contract law as well as many other things. Could I have an assurance from the Cabinet Secretary that she will continue to look at all of this as we move forward so that we are doing our very best to protect the victims of domestic abuse? Cabinet Secretary.
I'm very happy to give that assurance to Kevin Stewart, because I know the import that he places on these matters. I hope he sees that I have a similar objective, likewise members around the chamber. The second part of Katie Clark's amendment, I'm afraid, is unworkable and therefore I can't support it, but I assure further to Mr Stewart's intervention that I will continue to consider the contract law and other matters that are at play here, and I would also offer assurance to members across the chamber that this bill takes us a significant step forward in respect of the protection of the housing rights of people suffering abuse, not least through that existing new provision allowing for the ending of a joint tenancy, crucially with landlord's consent, but also through my commitment to see Part 2 of the Domestic Abuse Act implemented, which will provide that a social tenant and a victim of abuse can stay in her home and have the perpetrator removed. Amendment 329 in the name of Katie Clark would require social landlords, as part of their domestic abuse policy, to consider writing off a tenant's rent arrears due to domestic abuse. I'm pleased to say the bill already has provisions at sections 44 and 45 for social landlords to support tenants in this way. Section 45 requires social landlords to have a domestic abuse policy, which includes a description of the action which must be taken in relation to the needs of a tenant in these circumstances. Presiding Officer, I will support Amendment 111 in Megan Gallagher's name in respect of the Scottish Social Housing Charter, again bolstering the support that we offer to tenants suffering from domestic abuse. Amendment 17 from Maggie Chapman would oblige ministers to prepare and publish a timetable for implementing the December 2020 report on improving housing outcomes for women and children experiencing domestic abuse. I should like to have accepted this amendment because we're already implementing parts of that report. I'm afraid there's parts of that report which mean I cannot commit to implementing today. For example, one of the provisions is that legal advice should be freely available in the case of the suffering of domestic abuse. However, the Scottish Legal Aid Board will already provide legal advice, but the question of whether it's free is determined on whether the individual can afford to pay. So, whilst I place great priority on protecting the housing rights of women and children, I can't accept that amendment. Yes, I will.
Briefly, Maggie Chapman.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention, and I understand what she's saying, but given that elsewhere in other legislation that we've been discussing in this Parliament, indeed legislation that we passed not 2 weeks ago, there's clearly a desire to ensure that people who are victims, survivors of domestic abuse and these kinds of crimes do actually get that legal advice free, because it is so important in terms of their access to justice that is otherwise out with their ability to pay.
I understand entirely the point that Maggie Chapman puts to me. I'm afraid what I can't do is commit today to put it into primary legislation because the functions of the Scottish Legal Aid Board don't accord currently with what's asked of in that report. And, Presiding Officer, I will round my remarks off there with time in mind, just asking members to support my amendments and Megan Gallagher's Amendment 111.
Thank you. I call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 327 and other amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to the work that I know the Cabinet Secretary has done with Scottish Women's Aid, and because of that I won't be pressing Amendment 327. For my Amendment 17, I've also worked with Scottish Women's Aid on this, and the working group report that it refers to made a wide range of recommendations which were accepted by the Scottish Government. Some of them have already made their way into the bill as introduced, and as the Cabinet Secretary has said, some others are in train. However, the report was wide-ranging, and there were 27 recommendations, and we still have a way to go to see many of them implemented in full. So there's more work to be done on housing first strategies for victims and survivors, more on ensuring that homelessness policies are designed and implemented with a gendered lens, more on improving how homelessness that is due to domestic abuse appears in statistics. That's the premise behind my Amendment 17, and that's why I recommend inserting a simple monitoring process into the bill, whereby we check annually on progress on these recommendations. I believe it will help ensure we stay on track to implement those crucial recommendations in full, which the Scottish Government has already accepted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call Megan Gallagher to speak to Amendment 111 and other amendments in the group. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it's good to begin today's Housing Bill session on a really positive note. And can I thank both the previous Cabinet Secretary, Shirley-Anne Somerville, and Mary McCallan for their work with me on this amendment, which I hope will add that additional reassurance to survivors of domestic abuse that we are looking at all pieces of legislation to make sure that we are implementing measures to make it easier for people who have or who may or are currently experiencing domestic abuse. Amendment 111 would amend Section 32 of the 2010 Act to enable the Scottish Ministers, when setting standards and outcomes in the Scottish Social Housing Charter, to include standards and outcomes relating to the support social landlords should provide for tenants affected by domestic abuse. It also inserts a cross-reference to a definition of domestic abuse Abuse and the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021. I do understand the concerns that have been raised, perhaps by some stakeholders, that work will already be undertaken in relation to the Social Security Charter next year. However, when it comes to issues such as domestic abuse, I do believe that if the opportunity arises through the bills that we're discussing in Parliament presently, that we should be looking at ways in which we can strengthen charters, strengthen various pieces of legislation to make sure that we are protecting people who need protecting, and making sure that survivors of domestic abuse hear this message loud and clear, cross-party, that we are looking at all pieces of legislation to support them. Presiding Officer, I'm not going to speak to the rest of the amendments in this grouping because they've already been spoken to, and with that I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. Now Katie Clark to wind up. Press or withdraw Amendment 309. Ms Clark.
Thank you very much. And essentially the Cabinet Secretary seems to be saying that Amendments 309 to 312 and 329 are not required, as the bill will require that landlords adopt a domestic abuse policy, and that such rights are likely to be included in such policies. And of course it may be that these rights will be included, these specific rights will be included, and it may not be. And the purpose of these amendments, and indeed what I would say that the purpose of this bill should also be to do, is to ensure that we definitely have these rights in law, and that we're not reliant on individual social landlords up and down Scotland to develop their own policies, which may or may not include these rights. However, I very much hope that these amendments either pass today, or indeed that social landlords will be listening and ensure that such rights are put into any policies that are developed, because we have to ensure that individual tenants that are subjected to domestic abuse have these protections. I welcome that the Cabinet Secretary will come forward with regulations by Christmas to deal with the first part of my Amendment 328. The second part of my Amendment 328 is the part of the amendment which the Cabinet Secretary has indicated that she may have concerns about and is planning to come forward with regulations relating to. And I would be grateful to receive an assurance from the Cabinet Secretary that she has the statutory basis to do that, and that regulations will fully encompass the points that are being raised, because we need the law and the policy to enable both those that stay at home when they are subjected to domestic abuse and those that decide they have to leave to be given the protections they need. And the Cabinet Secretary has stated on quite a number of occasions, including in writing to me, that the Scottish Government's position is that victims should have the protections to be able to stay, but equally we need to make sure that we have the housing rights in place for situations where victims feel, for whatever reason, when they've been subjected to domestic abuse, that they have to leave. And that is the scenario that Amendment 328 is attempting to deal with, and has been drafted to address the gap in the law, which has been highlighted by many social landlords and indeed many of the campaigns, both who are campaigning on the rights of women who have been subjected to domestic abuse and indeed who work in the housing sector. So I would very much urge the Cabinet Secretary to look at this again. I hope that she will be able to support the amendments. She has indicated she will not be able to, but I hope in any process going forward that she will ensure that there aren't any gaps, because that's the issue that is being brought to me, brought to many others in this chamber. And my concern is that the way that this bill is drafted, it will not enable us to close all the drafts, to close all the gaps that clearly exist for women that are in this situation.
Just to clarify, you're pressing Amendment 309, Ms Clark?
I press my amendment.
The question is that Amendment 309 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, as this will be the first division of the stage. I suspend the session for around 5 minutes to allow members to access the digital voting system.